Jaipur Literature Festival's Charbagh. We are delighted to introduce session 95, the travel panel. We have with us travel writers Ramita Navai, Molly Crabapple, Carlo Pizzati, Eliza Griswold, and Isabella discuss the genre and read from their work. Let's welcome the panel with a huge round of applause.
Hello. I'm Molly Crabapple, and it is my most extreme honor to be moderating this panel on travel writers with such an extraordinary crew. Thank you so much to Jaipur Literary Festival for having me, and thank you so much to all of you for being here. Before I start, I need to ask a question, though. What does it mean when we talk about travel writing? Are we speaking about the self-glorifying stories of white men who stumble across poor countries, get sick from exotic food, and charm local people by knowing how to mispronounce the word hello? Do we mean books by fancy ladies who find God in an overpriced ashram? Is travel writing merely what is produced by rich people from Silicon Valley who wear tactical backpacks and jam themselves full of experience until they puke? Or do we mean the seamless wanderings of people with privileged blue passports who need no visas, no letters of recommendation, no bank statements to travel, nothing but the fact that the country that they were born in once looted the world? Because if that is what we mean by travel writing, then I say to hell with that. And that is not the stuff that interests me. Instead, I propose a more expansive definition of travel writing. Travel writing is the words we write when we move. It is the way we find ourselves by being amongst the other, and the way we can see the other more sharply when we are seeing him or her through new eyes. Travel writing is what Ibn Battuta wrote when he landed on the shores of Calcutta. And it is what a generation of Syrians have posted on Facebook when their rubber life rafts landed on the shores of Lesbos. It is found in the memoirs of topless dancers who have toured the strip clubs of America, and in the memoirs of the Renaissance sculptor Benvenuto Cellini, as he chased commissions and outran the law. When I speak of travel writing, it includes the words of the migrant, the dissident, the bad woman, and the escape artist. It belongs to all those who know that the only point of a border is to give us something to transgress. With that note of caution out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce our amazing panelists, who will each read from their writing. First, I would like to introduce you to Carlo Pizzati, who is the author of 2 novels, 3 nonfiction books, and a collection of short stories. He lives with his wife near a fisherman's village in India, where he writes about Asia for the Italian national daily La Stampa. He's a seasoned journalist who has worked for over 16 years for the Italian national daily newspaper La Repubblica, corresponding from New York, Rome, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Madrid. He's covered the Northern Ireland stripe, guerrilla war in Colombia, the narcos business in the Andes, illegal immigrant smuggling in Mexico, civil rights battles in Chile, pro-environment militancy in the French atoll of Mororora, and the GMO battle in Europe and the US. Thank you so much, Carlo.
Thank you, thank you. You want me to read? Yeah?
You go, I'll read last.
You want me to read my excerpt now?
Yes, you should read your excerpt.
Thank you for being here, and thank you to JLF for inviting me. I'd like to read you a brief excerpt from my latest book, which is a memoir, which is a title in the Tamil language, Mappilai, which means son-in-law. The subtitle is An Italian Son-in-Law in India. It's a journal of a stupid white man in a brown country. It's a serious book in funny clothes that talks about how I Indianized in these last 10 years, since 2008 and 2018. And the reason I came here was because I fell in love with a woman, an Indian woman. So the little excerpt I'm going to read you from, and I'm going to have to do it standing, sorry to turn my back. It's called Being Married in India. The subtitle is So Far So Good, So Far So Good, So Far So Good, So Far So Good. Marry the person you love the person you marry. Easily said. My take on married life, or on life in general for that matter, is briefly summarized by this image I have of a guy falling off a very high cliff and continuously saying to himself, so far so good, so far so good, so far so good, so far so good. Everything ends, you just never know when. No point in delving into timing. Enjoy while you have it. The impermanence of things. Lots of life's disasters are caused by expectations, reflections of dreams on a smoke screen, so you should just savor what you've got. It's kind of weird being married in India, and it can sometimes be weird being married to an Indian woman. In Italy, our obviously racially mixed marriage produces a corresponding rainbow of reaction. In their occasional racism, Italians often don't consider I may be married to a woman equally educated, equally smart, more successful, cosmopolitan, and worldly than they are. At first sight, some think I am the white man who went to rescue the lovely savage girl from the savage world. And I know this for sure. Men think lucky, women think weak. Sometimes they ask me if I'm not one of those Western men who, fatigued by the aggressive and argumentative nature of the relationship with some Western women, went to look for a meek Asian bride. None of them think of the possibility that I am generously being invited to live in my wife's house with the contribution of my equally generous in-laws. No one ventures into the theory that I may be the meek European groom treated lovingly by not only a family, but in generally by a welcoming, open arms India. Plus, they have no darned ideas about Indian women and what they're like. It feels so weird to me in New York or London or Venice or in my northern Italian hometown of Valdagno, and sometimes here in India, when I hear things like, you as a mixed couple, or you as a white man married to a woman of color. These things just make absolutely no sense to me. You know, they seem like something belonging to an end of an era which should long be over. And I don't mean to advertise any united colors of Benetton philosophy, but all these taxonomies, they just make no sense. Although I realize they are real, apparent, and obvious, but that's not the only cultural obstacle that hybrid couples like us can fall into. Sometimes, it takes a while to get accustomed to regular behavior, like walking down the street or strolling up and down Phoenix Shopping Mall in Chennai, one of the few places where you can walk for miles with the relief of fresh air conditioning. As I reach for my wife's hand, she waves me away like a Melania with a Donald and whispers all in one breath, no PDA, no PDA, no PDA. We're back in India now. Bummer. I go like, okay. Anyone can rub on every inch of your body in an overcrowded train or bus. You get to feel uncles' bellies rubbed against your backs, elbows, hips, in every possible queue without the flinching of an eye. And yet if a boy holds a girl's hands, some people start to bring out the knives. In some parts of India, it's true, you know it. In some parts of India, the anti-PDA brigades or the kiss vigilantes can publicly whip you, especially on St. Valentine's Day, if they catch you smooching in public. I mean, you can see wet T-shirt context in Bollywood flicks, but try that in real life, and you might get lynched. India contradictions are here, and they're here to stay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For several years, Isabella Tree was a senior travel correspondent on London's Evening Standard. She writes for The Guardian, Granta, and National Geographic. 3 of her 5 books are in the travel genre. She's written about Papua New Guinea, Mexico, and most recently, the living goddess cult of Nepal. Thank you so much for reading, Isabella.
So this is from my book, The Living Goddess, and it's about a cult in the Kathmandu Valley where the Newar community worship little girls, and it's very, very different from the sort of imagined cult that is talked about in the press. It took me 14 years to write this book, but I got to see a very different side of what this cult is all about. But this is when I first managed to actually come face to face with a living goddess that I could actually meet and talk to. In a tiny room with sky blue walls and earthen floor, the little goddess was sitting bolt upright on her throne against a backrest of green and silver nagas, their scaly heads conjoined in a crown hovering above her head. Her eyes flashed up as she watched me enter. She was no more than 6 years old. Her hair was combed tightly into a bun and tied with a red ribbon on top of her head. Thick lines of collyrium exaggerated her eyes and elongated them to her temples. Hanging around her neck over a scarlet jersey was a silver amulet box, the Yantramala of Talaju. Her bare feet, protruding beneath a scarlet skirt of satin brocade, rested expectantly in an offering tray. She was clutching the sides of her throne like the commander of a starship. Her expression, despite the freshness of her face and the adorable plumpness of her cheeks, deadly serious. I found myself smiling impulsively at her as I entered the room, but the gorgeous eyes, recalling me to respectfulness, returned an uncompromising glare. I ventured towards the living goddess's throne and, kneeling on the rice mat, bowed my head to her tiny feet, and I surrendered a 100 rupee note into her footplate before handing her my gift of a soft toy, a lion, the vehicle of Talaju. The little goddess reacted with lightning reflexes, accepting the offering with barely a glimmer of interest and deftly placing them to one side. I thought of my daughter, the same age, her fumbling, plump little fingers still struggling to get to grips with a button, her shyness so acute that she hid behind my legs at the sight of a stranger. The Kumari dipped her fingers into a dish at her side. As I craned forward to receive my blessing, the cold, wet touch of vermilion paste from her fingertips sent a tiny shockwave across my forehead. Like a queen knighting her subject, she handed me some petals to place on my head, and then an apple, prasad, which I touched to my forehead by way of thanks, before rocking back on my heels and struggling to my feet. Our ritual exchange was over. In the days following, I looked back on this encounter and wondered why it had affected me when so little, in fact, seemed to have happened. Finding myself on my knees for the first time since my school days had taken me by surprise. The physical feeling of the ground beneath me, my head lower than a child's, was a simple gesture, but it had profound psychological impact. It was a surrendering of the ego, a letting go of adults' assumptions of superiority and control. It was also a ritual that reaffirmed, at the highest level, the Newar belief that law and stability reposed ultimately in the forces of the divine feminine. The essential message was expressed whenever someone knelt before a living goddess, but the practice was not just confined to the worship of established Kumaris. To Newars, every little girl contained the essence of the goddess and had the potential to be a Kumari. The practice of Kumari puja was mirrored in every Newar household whenever there was a big event. Everyone in the family, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, would all kneel before the youngest girl of the house to receive her blessing. For the girl, it was empowering and life-affirming. it was also a reminder to everyone in society, but particularly men, of the expected standard of behavior towards women and young girls. Kneeling was more than an act of reverence. It changed the person doing it. It manifested a willingness in a person to open up to a source of wisdom and experience higher than their own. It imbued a sense of humility, and it overcame prejudice. I had knelt at the feet of a child, and in doing so, I realized I had, in some way, become a child again myself.
Thank you so much, Isabella. Ramita Navai is a Robert F. Kennedy Royal Television Society and Emmy Award-winning journalist, documentary maker, and author. She has reported from over 40 countries. Her book, City of Lies, Love, Sex, Death, and the Search for Truth in Tehran, won debut Political Book of the Year and the Royal Society of Literature's Jerwood Award. Thank you so much, Ramita, for reading for us.
I'm going to read from City of Lies, and this story, so City of Lies is about an underbelly of Tehran life, and this story is about a young man called Dariush who returns to Iran from exile on a secret mission to assassinate. Dariush walked north to a cafe on the corner of Vali As Street and Fereshta Street. It had been open for hours, serving kale pocha breakfasts. Louder, can everyone hear me?
Close your microphone closer to the mouth. Just keep the microphone close.
How's that? Better? Okay, great. So for those of you that didn't catch it, reading from my book City of Lies about the underbelly of life in Tehran, and this story is about a young man called Dariush who returns to Iran from exile on a secret assassination mission. Dariush walked north to a cafe on the corner of Vali Asr and Fereshta Street. It had been open for hours, serving kale pocha breakfasts, an entire sheep's head, tongue, eyes, cheeks, and all. It looked more like a laboratory than a cafe, with shiny white tiles on every wall and surface. The waiters even wore spotless lab coats as they dished out the dissected cuts of soft, slippery meat, the unforgiving glare of the high-voltage strip lights piercing through every slither of fat and muscle on the cheap white china plates. Dariush breathed in the sweet, warm stink of disintegrating flesh, bones, and cartilage. His mother had tried to make kale pocha in America a few times. They had eaten it glumly in silence, for kale pocha is a man's dish, and it reminded them of his father, who could make it better than anyone. His father, a devout monarchist, had been a civil servant in the Shah's government. When the militia had been roaming the streets and rounding up anyone they could find, he'd been taken in for questioning and was never seen again. Dariush spotted an empty table at the back near the kitchen counter. He weaved his way through the room, and as he sat down, a small glass of tea was banged on the table by a passing waiter. Behind him, steel pots puffed out streams of steam, the gentle murmur of boiling broth, a steady hum underneath the clashing plates and voices. He'd kept an eye out in the taxi to see if he was being followed. From where he was sitting, he had a clear view across the restaurant to outside. Nobody. He was early. He relaxed a little, allowing himself to survey the room. The diners were a curious mix. Bearded lone workmen and office clerks, eating quickly, head bows. Old regulars in pressed shirts, trading banter across the tables, their breakfast rituals unchanged for decades. Bright-eyed ramblers in wind cheaters and woolly socks, fueling themselves after treks in the Alborz Mountains, walking sticks and rucksacks propped up against the tables. They ate the slowest, enjoying every morsel after their dawn summit visits, having beaten the merciless sun and the trails clogged up with the amateurs. In the middle was a sight that both excited and disgusted him. A group in their teens and early 20s were slumped in their chairs and across the tables, heads resting on each other, feet sprawled out, sunglasses on their heads. They giggled and flirted and in whispers gossiped about their night. The girls were breathtakingly beautiful, even with smudged mascara and back-combed hair falling out of their tiny headscarves, stray strands stuck on their sweaty foreheads. Beautiful despite their improbably upturned noses, carved and chiseled by the surgeon's knife. They pouted their juicy lips, pushing out slurred words, throwing heads back and breasts forward as they laughed, showing off slender brown arms. They filled the room with their laughter, their dilated, spaced-out, ecstasy-pilled eyes, and the sweet smell of vodka moonshine that clung to their party clothes peeking through their manteaus, the Islamic regulation overcoats that women are obliged to wear in order to conceal curves. They slurped down the revelers' morning after favorite, big bowls of brain soup, a perfect hangover cure to soak up the drugs and booze that were still coursing through their bodies. Dariush was staring so intently at the girls that he did not notice his comrade enter the restaurant.
Thank you so much, Ramita. Eliza Griswold is a contributing writer at The New Yorker and a poet. She has spent the past 7 years writing about the human cost of energy in 2 Appalachian towns called Amity and Prosperity, which came out this year and during that time returned to Afghanistan to collect Pashtun women's folk poems for a book called I Am the Beggar of the World, which won the Penn Translation Prize in 2015. Eliza lives in New York City, where she's a distinguished writer in residence at NYU. Thank you so much, Eliza.
So, thank you so much. It's so much fun to be here with this crew. I can't even tell you. So, very quickly, this is a book about fracking, about a kind of gas development, natural gas development in Appalachia. And it's based on the idea, you know, in Western economists have, since the 90s, looked at something we call the resource curse, which is why is it that people who live on land richest in natural resources tend to be the poorest in the world. And of course, well, these economists have looked primarily at the global south. And the truth is that this phenomenon exists in America as well, and nowhere more so in Appalachia. So I spent much of the past 7 years in 2 towns called Amity and Prosperity, looking at the dynamic of more than a century of energy exploitation and how it is that rural Americans have paid for the energy appetites of urban Americans as a phenomenon that happens all around the world. So I'm just going to read you the beginning of that book. And it begins at a county fair in Appalachia. Fair 2010. Most years at the Washington County Fair, Stacy Haney set up an animal salon outside her blue and white Coachman trailer. She and her younger sister, Shelley, would plug a blow dryer into a generator and style their children's goats in preparation for the 4-H competition. This year, the salon seemed too much effort, so Stacy readied the goats at home. She'd spent the past 2 days up to her armpits in a blue kiddie pool of freezing water and mane and tail soap, washing, clipping, and brushing 2 goats, 2 pigs, and 4 rabbits. Then, that August morning, she'd hauled them 10 miles to the fairgrounds. After registering the rabbits, she proceeded to Cowley's lemonade stand with her 11-year-old daughter, Paige. 30 miles southwest of Pittsburgh, the Washington County Fairground was composed of 2 worlds. The lower realm contained the tilt-a-whirl, operated by strangers, roustabouts, who arrived from elsewhere. Stacy's son, Harley, who just turned 14, called it Carneyland. The upper belonged to 4-H and agriculture ag types, many of whom, including Stacy's family, considered themselves hoopies, an insider's name for the hilljacks or hillbillies who live in the borderlands of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, where Appalachia begins. These 2 worlds met midway up the ridge at Cowley's, where Stacy and Paige were waiting for lemonade when they spied 2 familiar figures trundling downhill from the horse barn. The square woman with frosted hair and the spare man with a snowy mane and a limp were Beth and John Voiles. They lived next door at Just a Breeze, a 15-acre farm where they trained horses and bred high-end dogs. The 2 families shared a fence and a love of animals. Beth treated her boxers like children. She cooked them angel hair pasta, zucchini and meatball sandwiches, and dressed them in tiny leather jackets, flight goggles, and scarves for professional photographs. She framed the photos and hung them around the ranch house where she'd lived with John for the past 28 years. Say what you might about the Voiles. Over the past year and a half, they'd proven excellent neighbors. While Stacy, who is 40, juggled full-time shifts as a nurse in the recovery unit of the nearby hospital and finalized her divorce, the Voiles kept a quiet eye on her place. Their daughter, Ashley, often brought her new boxer puppy, Cummins, down to distract Harley when he was sick at home. At 22, Ashley still lived at home and raced horses professionally. As Beth and John approached, Stacy could see that mascara was running down Beth's ruddy face. Stacy guessed it was the muggy heat. The air at the fair was redolent with popcorn and musk, which mingled with the scent of baby shampoo from mane and tail soap lingering on Stacy's arm. A rash blazed on Stacy's left arm, where it had been erupting on and off for months. Although she was a nurse, she couldn't determine its cause. She studied the welts, and when she looked up, Beth was in front of her, her face smeared with tears. "Cummins is dead," Beth said, "poisoned." Stacy's head swam. In her mind, she scanned the farmhouses and trailers that wended their way from the top of the valley where she and Beth live, down McAdams Road to the base of the hollow called the Bottoms. She knew nearly everyone. Most families were bound together by generations of helping one another farm, and more recently survived the economic collapse of the past several decades. No one would poison a puppy, she told Beth gently. Beth thought she knew otherwise. The vet had told her that Cummins' insides had frozen up, crystallized, as if he'd drunk antifreeze. The vet couldn't rule out cancer either, but Beth suspected foul play. She also thought she knew where the poison had come from. She'd seen the dog drinking from a puddle of water left on the roadside after a truck came through to spray down dust earlier that summer. Wondering what the liquid was, she tried to follow with a glass mason jar. But the driver stopped. Screeching his air brake on the steep dirt hill, he yelled at her to back away. Later, Beth and Stacy would mark this conversation about Cummins' death as the beginning of solving a mystery. But at the time, Stacy was sweaty and distracted. Paige stood by, crunching the sugar at the bottom of her lemonade cup. Stacy hugged Beth and watched her continue down the hill with John toward the field of neon. She wanted to get back to the trailer to check on Harley. She dreaded telling him the news. Harley loved Cummins, and he was so sick. Over the past year and a half, his stomach had churned with an undiagnosed illness. He'd missed most of 7th grade, sitting at home in a recliner, watching his dog Hunter play with Cummins on the living room floor. Harley had gone from being a shy and handsome basketball player who shambled easily through life to a listless stick figure. At 6'1", he was 127 pounds. A few days earlier, when Harley weighed his goat boots for competition at the fair, she weighed nearly the same as her master. Stacy hoped that this year's 4-H competition would lift his spirits. She and Harley had ambition for Boots. Instead of being skittish, as most goats are, Boots was friendly. Harley'd spent every day with her since he was home, which may have been why the brown and white boar goat enjoyed people. When Harley went up to the Haney's ramshackle barn to feed her, Boots slung her hooves over the wooden pen to lick his face.
Thank you so much, Eliza. So hey, I'm Molly Crabapple. I'm the author of Drawing Blood and Brothers of the Gun with the Syrian journalist Marwan Hisham. I'm an artist and a writer, and I've reported from all over the Middle East, from Guantanamo Bay, American prisons, and recently I had the honor of covering the Farmers' March in Delhi with my illustrations alongside the brilliant Indian journalist Rohini Mohan. And I'm going to read a short piece about Puerto Rico, which is a small Caribbean island that was colonized by the United States and was recently destroyed by a hurricane about a year ago that people are still sort of recovering from. There is no victor but God. So reads the Arabic calligraphy that adorns the facade of the French restaurant at 311 Calle de la Fortaleza in San Juan, Puerto Rico, right above the Moroccan tiles. There is no victor but God. How many people have stopped to look at this saying? How many can even read the elaborate Arabic script? The same saying, in the same font, also borders the tiles in the antechamber of El Ateneo Puertorriqueño, the island's oldest cultural institution. Some ceramicist must have made them in bulk. The saying was the motto of the Nasirids, the last Muslim dynasty to rule a corner of Spain, and the builders of the Alhambra in Granada. In 1492, the Nasirids surrendered their exquisite capital to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella, good Christian monarchs, who immediately expelled all the Jews from Spain. With the lucre they looted from the last outpost of Al-Andalus, Ferdinand and Isabella financed an Italian named Cristobal Colon to cross the ocean blue. Thinking he would find India on the other side of the Atlantic, Columbus brought along with him a forcibly converted Granadan Jew, Luis de Torres, to translate for him in what was then considered the lingua franca of the civilized infidel. When Columbus crashed his boat off the coast of an island that its Taino inhabitants called Quisqueya, Luis de Torres attempted to speak to his rescuers in Arabic. The language of the Nasirids thus became the first foreign tongue uttered in the Caribbean. The next year, Columbus landed in Borinquen, a smaller island to Quisqueya's east, also inhabited by the unfortunately peaceful Taino. Once Spain learned of the gold that clogged Borinquen's rivers, they named the island Puerto Rico, rich port. The Tainos are gone now, murdered by Columbus and the explorers who came after him. Isabella lies in the dirt beside her Ferdinand, and the globe-spanning Spanish Empire they founded is dead as well, impoverished by a sequence of calamities that began perhaps with the Inquisition and culminated in the popped housing bubble of 2008. In the region once called Al-Andalus, unemployment now brushes 27%, and Spanish squatters appropriate farmland in the formerly Moorish countryside outside Sevilla. Spain lost Puerto Rico in 1898 to a new empire, the United States of America. President William McKinley's gunships shelled San Juan Harbor, but his armies entered the island bringing sugar monopolies and race science, and promises that they would be much nicer colonizers than the colonizers who came before. 120 years later, Puerto Ricans can be the judge of this. The US is now an empire in its early death throes. To demonstrate the remnants of its power, it shoots missiles at evacuated military facilities in Damascus, after the Syrian government murdered civilians with chlorine gas in Douma. Damascus was, of course, the capital of the Umayyads. In 750, Abdul Rahman I, the last heir to the Umayyad dynasty, fled Damascus, with his whole family dead at the hands of the Abbasid enemies. 5 years later, he landed in Spain. There, he founded the great city of Cordoba, the sprout from which all of Al-Andalus, including the Alhambra, would bloom. Not bad for Europe's first Syrian refugee. But where is Abdul Rahman now, and where is Al-Andalus? Does it exist only in traces like those on 311 Calle de la Fortaleza? There is no victor but God. This calligraphy, copied, unread, from the Nasirids' Alhambra, brought over, uncomprehended, as decoration for a French restaurant on a hurricane-gutted island, might just be the best epitaph for our age. Because who wins, really, in the end? Is it Columbus or William McKinley? Isabella or Abdul Rahman? Who built the thing that lasts? Or are the winners merely those who find their most cherished mottos repurposed as ornament in glazes of blue and emerald, glazed over by a bored tourist's eyes? There is no victor but God. I do not believe in God, which is to say that I believe that after death comes an all-consuming blankness, a void that my mind conceives of as eternity. And I know that this, in truth, is the only thing that lasts. Over the last 3 years, I commuted back and forth to Istanbul to write a book with a Syrian journalist about his country's nightmare. On one visit, I saw graffiti that read, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." War is the factory that produces victors, along with its far more numerous victims. This sentence, scrawled on the walls of a city that has seen victors and victims for 2.5 millennia, makes a nice rejoinder to the Nasirids' favorite quote. There is no victor but God. Keep on fighting, humans. Only God wins in the end. And as for all you others, you Columbuses and William McKinleys, you Abdul Rahmans and Isabellas, you mortal beings whose wars led the way for this calligraphy to end up on this French restaurant on this Caribbean island, all the rest of you, just you wait. Thank you. So when we were sitting in the green room discussing this panel, one of the things that Carlo mentioned that stuck with me is that we asked ourselves, what does travel writing mean at this moment? At this moment of increasing homogenization, globalization, where places that tourists come to create themselves into parodies of themselves to make more monies, where, as Carlo said, the best travel work is now posted on Instagram. And the question that I wanted to put to the panel is, at this moment, what does travel writing mean to you, and how do you do it right?
Who goes first? Would you like to answer? Yeah, okay. As the token rugged white man in an all-female panel, I get to go first, thank you. If you are an Indian writer and you move to America and you write a novel called, I don't know, like Immigrant Montana, then you go to an immigration panel. But if you're an Italian writer and you move to India and you write a memoir about your 10 years in India, you go to a travel panel. So what I'm trying to, I'm glad you understand, because what I'm trying to say is, I am not an expat. I am an immigrant, and I didn't write a travel book, because I wrote a book which is a counter-travel book. It's about a traveler who stopped and started to become a local in a little fisherman village in Tamil Nadu, which I think for me it's more interesting right now than bringing the necessary perspective that someone from a different culture has to take when he goes to a foreign culture, right? So nowadays, we don't need that anymore so much. I mean, if you want to find out about the local culture, you can perfectly read someone from that culture, I think. Or you can investigate inside yourself and explain what your internal landscape is and how it is transformed by your experience of alienation in a new culture, which is what I somewhat, with a light tone and trying to keep a comic language, let's say, have tried to do with Mappilai by simply telling how out of place I felt sometimes, how I learned the importance of not paying immediately the traffic bribe, but talking it down a little bit, how to stand in line if you have to get to the post office or get an Aadhaar card or buy a car or open a bank account, and be taught the very important virtue of patience, which is what India has taught me. So for me, it's more interesting nowadays to investigate as a traveler who becomes a local, how you are transformed, rather than putting some maybe sometimes maybe not well-informed judgments on a country you don't know, which is what can happen. I'm not saying that it happens all the time, because we have had throughout history fantastic example of wonderful travel writers who contributed to literature, to non-fiction and fiction altogether. All I'm saying that nowadays, since the world has changed and since information about culture is so easily available, you have to do another investigation, another voyage, which is more internal.
And
Thank you.
No, Isabella, though maybe you dispute, you are the only legitimate travel writer on this panel. And for your last book, you spent 14 years investigating it and 14 years writing it. What I'd like to hear from you is, in this age where everyone is so distracted on Twitter, where we have such trouble focusing, what is the value of going deep and spending time in your work?
Well, I think it's exactly that. I mean, I think if there's a value to so-called travel writing, and I think it's a very difficult genre to define. But if you're writing about a place and going deeper into it, I think there's always a value because you're writing it from a place of patience where you've got time to spend. And I think it's very difficult in this, hopefully people read, but even if they I mean, it's very exciting to hear that, audiobooks are on the rise, because at least, you're still getting the messages across. But I think from a perspective of going back to a place again and again, which is what I did with Kathmandu over a period of 14 or 15 years, from an objective stance, you can go back and see how things have changed, whereas if you're actually living in that place non-stop, those changes can be very imperceptible. So if you're going back, say, once a year or even once every 2 years, you can sense and see how things are changing quite dramatically when it's very difficult to see from the inside. So I'd like to think that there is still an interest in reading more deeply about places, especially if one is only going for, say, a week and you want to explore it a bit more deeply. Yeah.
Speaking of change over time, Ramita, your book, City of Lies, is about the place where you were born and then where you were exiled from for many years and then you returned to as an adult. It's about the city of Tehran. What was that like, to write about the place that you're from that had changed so radically in the time that you were away?
Well, personally, it was really important for me. I was rediscovering my roots as well as rediscovering this remarkable, fascinating country. It was also interesting because I was an outsider, so I had the outsider's eye, but I was also an insider. I spoke the language. It's my culture, it's my country. And in fact, I'm really interested in what you have to say, Eliza, about reporting from America, because we've both reported from so many different countries, and all of a sudden we're reporting from, well, my home country, but also, I guess, a part of the country which you don't know that well. So you're the same. You're an outsider, yet an insider. Yeah. So for me, that was a really interesting experience, and really important to my work. But I was also thinking about what Carlo was saying. For me, it was really important to not write about my experience. Well, first of all, I'm not interesting enough to write about myself. But what was interesting is that the publishers, when I first was pitching this book, a lot of the publishers wanted me in the book, wanted more of a kind of wanted a memoir and wanted more of a kind of a travel book, really, a travel writer's book. They wanted me to be the connecting thread, my experiences to inform the way I saw Tehran. And for me, it wasn't about me at all. It was about the people I met and the people's stories and how they told you something about the country, not my experience. So that's exactly how I approached City of Lies.
And I'd love to hear as well, so you've done work both about Appalachia and also, you've done work with these Pashtun women. And I'd love to hear about the similarities and the contrasts in doing that sort of work, and also about reporting on America, which is a country that I feel like often as Americans, people are like, what's America like? And I'm like, it's so many countries, I can't say that with any sort of objectivity.
Yeah. So, like others up here, I came of age as a journalist with the beginning of Americans' foreign adventures after September 11th, right? So I spent most of the past 15 years covering conflicts born of American imperialism, as you're talking about. And then many years ago, we were talking before the panel began, that a wonderful, wonderful editor in London said to me when I was setting off for somewhere some years ago, a guy named Ian Jack, who started Grant, I think, said, why is it that Americans never write about America? Why are you always going somewhere else? And I carried that with me for a lot of years, especially as we've seen in the US, the social safety nets, things that we used to take for granted really falling apart. And one of the expressions of this actually has to do with crumbling infrastructure, that the bridges and the roads and the internet in America are just falling apart at a rapid pace. And I was in northern Nigeria some years ago when a bridge collapsed and decided to go back to the US and look at how do we tell the story of collective poverty? I mean, how do we tell more sophisticated stories about suffering than the story of the lone individual, which is not very interesting. And I, like Ravita, I'm not interested in writing about self, right? It's not my thing. So So I was, to your question, so I set out for southwestern Pennsylvania to look at this legacy of resource extraction, and it was just after fracking had come to town. And the woman I read about, Stacey Haney, and her 14-year-old son, who had just contracted this very mysterious illness. Turns out they had benzene, toluene, they had gas in their blood, in their urine, and they'd been poisoned by the gas well next to them. But at the same time, I was still working in Afghanistan, and I was pregnant with my first little person, my first and only, one and done. And I had to get back to Afghanistan before he was born. So I went, and I had to finish collecting these poems. So I went back to Afghanistan, and I, of course, I thought that, you know, I've worked there, you know, for many, many years, and I thought these women who were my friends would be like, we're so proud of you for coming, you know, it's such an important time. No, being pregnant for many Afghan women is like having a terrible flu just once again, and they're like, ugh, poor you, right? So anyway, the parallels between the experiences have to do, especially in rural Pashtun cultures and in Appalachia, as in rural places all over the world. There's a misunderstanding of conservatism and religion, a lot of justification of what is cultural, looks like religious, a lot of suspicion about outsiders, and a lot of excellent, superior joke telling. Because when you don't have a lot to do and the lights are not on at night, you're going to find something else that's far more fun. So that's what I'd say in short.
I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. I'm going to call on a woman first, so a woman better raise her hand, or else we're going to. Do we have any, or am I? Yes, madam, please.
Hi, my question to Carlo. I read your book; it's fabulous. My question to you is, as I know you don't consider yourself an outsider completely, but how do you bring about, like most books on India are either romantic or they are poverty, and yours strikes a balance and it feels real. So how did you, in the process of writing, I know it's your experience, but how is it you bring about the right mix of both? How is it that you try to, you communicate the good as well as the bad. Communicating the good is easy. How do you communicate the not so good about society with the humor and with objectivity? Like, I cannot disagree with you when you talk about the bad of Indian society. How is it that you have got that perspective in?
I promise we've never met before, and I did not ask her to ask the question this way, but thank you. Sounded more like a compliment than a question. Thank you so much. It was a big challenge, obviously. Seriously, obviously, I thought about that. Our Western ears are deaf to the constant images of poverty, I think, to that cliche, or that stereotype. So I thought I need to do something a little bit more useful, which is closer to how I perceive my experience here. And I also took on a little bit of an Indian point of view by having Indian friends of my age or younger that I hang out with and give them the voice. So for example, there is this some topics that deal not only with how you deal with the help, the looking away syndrome, right? How do you cohabit with people that you want to communicate humanly with, but it's difficult sometimes because they are your dependents, I suppose, right? So there's a whole investigation into that, but also race relationship. How do the Tamils see me? So what I did is I tried to give voice to the people that I talk to and let them reveal to me the secrets. And this allowed me to keep a little bit of that balance. And the humor, I guess, comes from seeing myself as a ridiculous middle-aged white man who doesn't understand much. So if I start with that in the morning writing, everything goes fine. As soon as I go, on the podium and I think that I'm going to lecture you and explain to the world what India is, it's finished. Thanks for the question. Thank you.
Do we have another question?
Hi. So my question is for Isabella, and Ramita mentioned that she didn't want her book to be about herself, and she wanted to be about the community she was writing about.
Sorry, I can't quite hear
Sorry.
you.
I'm so sorry. Okay. Ramita said that she didn't want her book to be about herself, and she wanted it to be about the community she was writing about. And I realized that your book was definitely bringing out some experience, your own experience, because it was essential, your experience was essential to bring about the Kumari's influence on people when she was present. So I was wondering, how did you balance that out, bringing out your own experience as well as talking really well about that community and the cult?
Yeah, I mean, it is very difficult. I, again, came under huge pressure from my publisher to make it more experiential and make myself more a part of the book. And I had to make a decision very early on that I was not going to do that because I felt my subject was so interesting and I was finding out so much new research. And it goes back into history, my book, and also into contemporary culture and also, I hope, debunks a lot of myths about Kumari worship that are promulgated in the press very commonly and that are repeated on Twitter and social media and everything. So, but I think I recognize that it's a very tantric tradition, as you probably know. It's bound up with secrecy. So I was never going to understand a lot about it. I was never going to be shown the deepest inner secrets of Tantra. But what I could do was show enough to the outside world for the outside world to know that it was worth respecting and worth saving. So I think, in a sense, I felt that that there was a role there to be a kind of gatekeeper with one foot in another culture and your another foot in the outside world that you were trying to project to. So it is a balance, and I was very conscious of not wanting myself, my ego, to intrude on this amazing tradition.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, my question is also to Isabella. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I wanted to know how, you said over 14 years you researched and you wrote the book. So how did you gain access to whatever part of information that community was willing to share with you? The question more towards the process of writing. So were there people whom you built relationship with and they knew this is what you're doing and then they kind of were your window? I just am curious to understand that.
Well, it was really, it was partly luck and partly persistence, I think. I first traveled to Kathmandu when I was 18, so I first saw the Kumari when I was 18. So I'd had a real interest in her from a young age. But it wasn't, it was very difficult to get any proper information about the cult while I was there. And suddenly the royal family massacre happened. I don't know if you remember, and the crown prince killed his entire family. And this was in 2001. And I really felt I had to go out there and look at this Kumari tradition again because it looked like it was very much under threat because the king had been a great patron of the Kumari tradition. And that's when I found doors were kind of opening. Friends that I had met before who had perhaps been rather cagey about talking to me now felt that their tradition was on the line. And so they were ready to open up. And it's been an extraordinary, extraordinary journey because I now have great friends who are tantric priests and ex-Kumaris and Kumari caretakers, and I'm still very much in touch with them and go back every 5 years to see them all. So it's an ongoing journey, in fact, but it's been amazing. Yeah.
Thank you so much to Carlo, to Isabella, to Ramita, and to Eliza. It was such an honor to do this panel, and thank you so much to all of you for asking such amazing questions. We all have books that we will be signing, and signing books is how us authors continue to eat and live and walk about in this world. So if you feel so moved, please buy one. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.